It's 8:20 a.m., April 18, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle is strapped into the cockpit of a B-25 Mitchell bomber on the deck of the USS Hornet, 650 miles from Japan. His engines are screaming, the carrier is pitching in heavy seas, and he has exactly 467 feet of runway to get a fully loaded bomber airborne, less than half what he needs. Behind him, 15 more bombers are lined up wing to wing. 80 American airmen who volunteered for a mission so secret they didn't know their target until yesterday. Their orders are simple: bomb the Japanese homeland, then fly to China and hope for the best. This isn't a strategic bombing campaign. This is pure psychological warfare, a desperate gamble to prove that America can strike back. Japan's military leaders have promised their people that the homeland is invulnerable. In the next 6 hours, 16 bombers are going to shatter that myth forever. But here's what makes this mission truly impossible. These bombers were never designed to take off from aircraft carriers. The fuel calculations say they can't make it to safety. And if they're captured, Roosevelt has secretly authorized their crews to be executed as war criminals. This is the story of the Doolittle Raid, the day America proved that no empire is untouchable. Four months after Pearl Harbor, America was losing badly. The Philippines had fallen, MacArthur was in retreat, and Japanese forces controlled everything from Alaska to Australia. American morale was at rock bottom, and Roosevelt knew it. On January 10, 1942, the president called Admiral Ernest King to the White House with a simple question: "Can we bomb Japan?" King's answer changed everything. "Not with what we have now, but give me 60 days. The problem was distance. Japan was an island fortress, surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean controlled by the Imperial Navy. American bombers couldn't reach Japan from any existing base. Aircraft carriers could get close enough, but no bomber could take off from a carrier deck. Enter Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine warfare expert with a crazy idea. Walking past Norfolk Naval Base, he watched Army bombers practicing touch-and-go landings and had a revelation. What if we could launch Army bombers from a Navy carrier? Everyone said it was impossible. Army bombers were too big, too heavy, needed too much runway. But Lowe took his idea to Admiral William "Bull" Halsey, who loved impossible missions. Halsey's response was immediate: find someone crazy enough to try it. That someone was James Doolittle, test pilot, aeronautical engineer, and the first man to fly blind using instruments alone. Doolittle had been grounded from combat because he knew too many military secrets. But when they offered him the chance to lead 16 bombers against Japan, he didn't hesitate. "When do we leave?" The mission planning was insane. They had to modify B-25 Mitchell bombers, remove gun turrets to save weight, install extra fuel tanks, strip out everything non-essential. The planes would be so heavy they'd need every inch of the Hornet's deck just to get airborne. But the real challenge wasn't technical, it was political. If the mission failed and crews were captured, Japan would have propaganda gold, American airmen attacking civilian targets. Roosevelt made a chilling decision. The mission would be classified as a special aviation project. If crews were captured, America would deny knowledge of their existence. In February 1942, Doolittle assembled his crews at Eglin Field in Florida. He needed volunteers for a mission he couldn't describe, to a target he couldn't name, with survival odds he couldn't calculate. His recruitment speech was brutally honest. "This is extremely hazardous. If you have any doubt, drop out now, no questions asked." Not a single man dropped out. The training was unlike anything in military history. They practiced carrier takeoffs on a runway marked to match the Hornet's deck, 467 feet with the end painted to look like ocean waves. Most pilots needed 1,200 feet to get a B-25 airborne. They had to learn to do it in less than half that distance. Doolittle flew the first test himself. As his bomber approached the end of the simulated deck, still 20 feet from takeoff speed, everyone thought he was about to crash. At the last possible second, the B-25 lifted off, with just yards to spare. But the technical challenges were just beginning. The bombers would have to fly 2,400 miles total. 650 miles from the carrier to Japan, then 1,200 miles to airfields in China controlled by friendly forces. The problem: fully loaded with bombs and extra fuel, the planes would be right at the edge of their maximum range. Doolittle's solution was typically bold: strip everything possible, fly at minimum fuel consumption, and plan to arrive in China on fumes. It would work. Barely. On April 2nd, the Hornet left San Francisco with 16 B-25s lashed to her deck. The crews still didn't know their target. Speculation ran wild. The Philippines, Wake Island, maybe even Germany. The truth came on April 13th, when Captain Mark Mitcher called all hands to the ship's loudspeakers. "This force is bound for Tokyo." The cheers could be heard across the entire task force. But that same day, everything started going wrong. The original plan called for launching 400 miles from Japan at midnight, giving the bombers darkness to approach their targets and daylight to find the Chinese airfields. But Japanese patrol boats had spotted the task force 650 miles out, 250 miles further than planned. Admiral Halsey faced an impossible choice: abort the mission or launch immediately in broad daylight with insufficient fuel. His message to Doolittle was 3 words: launch planes, good luck. Doolittle's response revealed the steel nerves of a test pilot. "We're going now." No hesitation, no second guessing, just acceptance that they were all probably going to die. The launch conditions were horrific. The Hornet was pitching in 30-foot swells, the deck was slick with spray, and crosswinds were gusting at 40 knots. One mistake, an engine failure, a gear collapse, a moment's hesitation, and 16 bombers would go straight into the Pacific. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle pushed his throttles forward and began his takeoff roll. The Hornet's deck crew had never launched Army bombers before. They were making it up as they went along. The deck officer had one job: drop his flag when Doolittle reached the end of the deck, signaling the exact moment to pull back on the stick. Doolittle's bomber reached the deck edge, still 10 knots below takeoff speed. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like the plane would drop into the ocean. Then, caught by the headwind over the Hornet's bow, the B-25 suddenly lifted and climbed away. One by one, all 16 bombers launched successfully. A miracle of precision flying and blind luck. But they were still 650 miles from Japan, flying in broad daylight, with fuel for maybe one chance at their targets. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, pilot of the 7th bomber to launch, later wrote, "We were past the point of no return the moment our wheels left the Hornet's deck. There was no turning back, no alternate plan, no rescue if things went wrong. We were committed to bombing Japan or dying in the attempt." The formation split up to attack multiple targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. Doolittle himself would lead the attack on Tokyo, targeting aircraft factories and military installations. The psychological impact was the real goal, proving that Japan itself was vulnerable. At 12:30 p.m. Tokyo time, air raid sirens began wailing across Japan for the first time in the war. Most Japanese civilians had never heard the sound before. The homeland was supposed to be invulnerable. Doolittle's bomber approached Tokyo flying at rooftop level to avoid radar detection. What he saw below shocked him. People in the streets looking up and waving, thinking the planes were Japanese. The concept that enemy bombers could reach Japan was so impossible that civilians didn't recognize the threat until bombs started falling. The attack lasted less than 30 minutes, but its impact was catastrophic, not to Japanese industry, but to Japanese psychology. The emperor himself had been forced into an air raid shelter. The sacred homeland, protected by divine wind, had been violated by foreign barbarians. Lieutenant Robert Gray, attacking the Yokosuka naval base, dropped his bombs from just 200 feet and watched Japanese sailors diving for cover. "It was surreal," he later said. 6 months ago, these same people were celebrating Pearl Harbor. Now they were running from American bombs. But the raid's real success was measured in Japanese panic, not physical damage. Within hours, the Japanese military was recalling fighter squadrons from the Pacific to defend the homeland. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, was forced to admit the unthinkable. "The enemy has brought the war to our shores." The human cost was minimal, fewer than 100 Japanese casualties, but the strategic impact was enormous. Japan's entire defensive strategy was built on the assumption that their homeland was unreachable. Doolittle had just proven that assumption wrong. The bombing was the easy part. Now came the real challenge, getting to China alive. All 16 bombers were running on fumes, flying over 1,000 miles of enemy-controlled territory with darkness approaching. The Chinese airfields were supposed to guide them in with radio beacons, but Japanese jamming made navigation nearly impossible. One by one, the bombers disappeared into the night. Some crash-landed on beaches, others ran out of fuel over mountains. Several crews bailed out in the darkness, hoping to find friendly forces. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew was captured immediately after crash landing near Japanese positions. Within days, they were in Tokyo, being tortured for information about American plans. The Japanese military was desperate to know, was this the first wave of a massive invasion? 8 airmen were captured in total. 3, including Hallmark, were executed as war criminals after show trials in Tokyo. 5 survived Japanese prison camps, but barely. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical abuse. But most crews made it to Chinese-controlled territory, where they were hidden by villagers who risked their own lives to help American airmen. The Chinese people paid a terrible price for their assistance. Japanese forces launched the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign in retaliation, killing an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians suspected of helping Doolittle's crews. Doolittle himself crash-landed in a rice paddy and was convinced he'd be court-martialed for losing all 16 bombers. Instead, he was promoted to general and awarded the Medal of Honor. Roosevelt's citation was simple: for conspicuous leadership above and beyond the call of duty. The immediate military impact of the Doolittle Raid was minimal. 16 bombers couldn't seriously damage Japanese war production, but the psychological impact changed the course of World War II. In America, morale soared overnight. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans had struck back at Japan itself. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Tokyo bombed." Movie theaters erupted in cheers when newsreels showed bombers launching from the Hornet. But the real impact was in Japan. The raid shattered Japanese confidence in their military leadership and exposed the vulnerability of the homeland. More importantly, it forced Japan into a strategic mistake that would doom their empire. Admiral Yamamoto, humiliated by the attack, became obsessed with destroying the American carrier force that had made the raid possible. This obsession led directly to the Battle of Midway, Japan's disastrous attempt to lure American carriers into a decisive battle. At Midway, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and most of their experienced pilots. The raid that had cost America 16 bombers ultimately cost Japan the war in the Pacific. Emperor Hirohito reportedly told his advisors, "The raid has done more damage to our war effort than 10,000 bombers could have done to our cities." He was talking about damage to Japanese morale and strategic thinking, not physical destruction. When I think about the Doolittle Raid, what strikes me most is how 16 bombers accomplished what massive military campaigns couldn't. They changed the psychological balance of an entire war. The raid succeeded because it attacked something more valuable than military targets. It attacked the Japanese belief in their own invincibility. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the biggest bomb or the newest technology. It's the willingness to attempt the impossible when everyone says it can't be done. Doolittle's volunteers teach us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're fighting for something bigger than themselves. These weren't superhuman warriors. They were mechanics and farmers and college kids who chose to risk everything for a mission that probably couldn't succeed. Today, when we face challenges that seem impossible, whether it's global pandemics, climate change, or threats to democracy, the Doolittle Raid reminds us that the impossible becomes possible when people refuse to accept defeat. The 80 men who flew that mission knew they probably wouldn't survive. They went anyway, because they understood that some things are worth dying for. Their courage didn't just change a war, it changed the world. In our next episode, we'll see how Japan's reaction to the Doolittle Raid led to the greatest naval battle in history, Midway, where the course of the Pacific War was decided in just 4 minutes. This has been The Story Arc, where we connect the past to the present. I'm your host, and I'll see you next time.